Hi, today I'm going to be speaking with you about 3 important technical considerations for the saxophone. My name's Joshua Hatcher and I'm one of the Woodwind teachers here at Jazz Music Institute. I believe that having a strong technique is quite essential for free musical expression. There are several different elements to technique on every instrument. On the saxophone, I suppose some of the key ones are the 3 areas that we're going to talk about today. So what happens in your hands, what happens inside of your mouth, and then also what happens just with your overall air management. Seeing as we play a wind instrument, air is pretty essential and has to be understood. Okay, so the first topic that I want to talk about has to do with the hands. So one of the sort of very common issues that I guess beginning saxophone players have, and some more advanced players still, is having their fingers moving about out of control. This can happen in several different kind of key ways. One way is the flying fingers, which is where you have your fingers coming way off the keys. It's pretty inefficient in that you're going to be having to come back from a long way off keys and you might miss the keys. Also, it just slows you down. So just something to think about. Another common technical issue in the hands is actually just having too much tension and basically having the joints collapsing. So this is, you'll see this, the white knuckle saxophone playing, where you have the joints actually collapsing, so operating in the opposite direction of how they're actually designed in terms of biomechanics. So there's two considerations that I'd suggest. One is just the hand shape can solve a lot of things. So having just a very relaxed hand, if you shake your hands out and allow them to become really relaxed, you'll notice that there is a slightly rounded shape to the fingers, like this, okay? So I find, for me, that if I just take this hand shape and put it on the saxophone, I end up landing my fingers pretty much right on the pearls. Same thing for the other hand. Slot it right on. Just fits right on the horn like that. So that works pretty well for me in terms of the hand shape. That keeps my fingers rounded and allows me to operate it allows me to operate from primarily this knuckle where I'm making the movement and getting my power from, rather than with a flatter finger, which is actually operating from here. And I find it's a bit of a blunt instrument to be trying to do something very finessed with. Okay, so hand shape is quite important. Then in terms of actually being able to play without tension in the hands and without the unnecessary flying fingers approach, there's an exercise that I would suggest, which is having all the fingers on the saxophone and focusing on the 4 fingers on each hand. The thumbs are just supporting for now. So focusing down the front of the instrument and trying to have finger independence. So just pressing the first finger down and releasing, maintaining finger contact on the pearls and also on the pinky tables there, right down the horn the whole time. So first finger comes down and up, second finger comes down and up, third finger and fourth finger. That's on the left hand, and then on the right hand, first finger and up, second finger and up, third finger and up, fourth finger and up. So what's important with that exercise is actually maintaining constant contact, particularly as we go sort of down to the second, third, and fourth fingers on the hand. You might notice that things want to start moving independently, even though I'm trying to press my third finger, my fourth finger might come up, things like that. So focus on the individual fingers first and just making sure that you've got good control over them. You can then slot that into an exercise, for example, taking a tempo and trying to play through those two hands in time. For example, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So that gives you a way to sort of practice your finger coordination and finger independence and overall control, thinking about hand shape, which eliminates the collapsing of the fingers, as well as maintaining constant contact on the keys themselves, which eliminates the flying fingers. So check that one out. The second area I want to talk about today has to do with articulation. Now, there's definitely not only one way to articulate on the saxophone. Like many things when we do with the saxophone, there's heaps of room for personal style, heaps of different effects you can get from using different approaches. But my personal approach seems to come back always to wanting to find efficient ways to do things and ways that help to cultivate consistency so that I just know it's going to work when I reach for that particular tool in my toolbox. Okay, so articulation is what I'd like to talk about. So the key factor here is utilizing somewhere near the tip of the tongue and making contact with somewhere near the tip of the reed. Now, I think we need not be overly prescriptive about saying it has to be the tip of the tongue on the tip of the reed. There's definitely room for different tones and sounds, and everyone's anatomy is a little bit different. So, you might find that if I say do it this way, you might not be able to actually physically do that, and that's okay. So I think it's best to talk in sort of a little bit broader conceptual terms, and the idea of the tip of the tongue, or being near the tip of the tongue and near the tip of the reed, is basically just making for an optimized kind of contact point in the articulation. So when we are utilizing the tip of the tongue or near the tip of the tongue, it's the sort of smallest part of the tongue in terms of surface area that we're going to actually be contacting the reed with. It has the most nuanced ability to adapt its shape and the angle. So being at the tip, there's more control that we can assert in terms of choosing the angle that we touch the reed and the way that we come at the reed. The reason we would want to be operating near the tip of the reed is because it is the most responsive part of the reed. You can get it vibrating very quickly with the tongue coming off the reed, and also you can stop it very quickly, as well as being able to use some sort of interesting techniques where sometimes you're still playing whilst the tongue is even on the reed. So that's possible if you're articulating near the tip of the reed, but may not be possible if you're articulating further back. Okay, so there are a couple of exercises if you're, for example, unsure of what you're actually doing in terms of articulation, because that's a fairly common thing, is that people may not actually really have ever thought about how they're articulating. Something you can try is to just take one note. So on the tenor saxophone today, I'm going to be playing a G. Take one note and put the tongue on the reed. So that's going to be no sound to start with. Take the tongue off the reed with the airstream. It's going to start the note, and then keep the airstream going and put the tongue back on the reed and then repeat the process. Sounds complicated. I'll demonstrate it, and you'll hear it. Notice you can hear my air still moving even when I've got the tongue on the reed. The point of the exercise is not necessarily to show you this is how you play all the time, but it's just to become aware of the contact with the reed and help you think about where the note starts when the tongue comes off the reed and where the note ends when the tongue goes on the reed, but without having to manage the air supply as much. It's just more of a constant and you're just thinking about the tongue. So we're sort of isolating it like that. Okay, so practicing like that, obviously very slowly, is a good thing if you are unaware of what you're doing with your articulation. Just helps you develop more awareness of where you are on your tongue, where you are on the reed, and how the two work together. Then in terms of like trying to translate that to a more musical setting, not just a sort of a diagnostic setting, you could try continuing just with the one note, but trying to make that a little bit more legato. So reducing the amount of time that tongue is spending on the reed to the point where it's negligible and we're really just slicing the airstream like this. I'm focusing on really light motion, like really light contact with the reed and a very supple motion. A very common issue that many beginning players have is that they're really slamming the reed, like really hitting the reed. And the issue with that is that the reed itself, if you're applying force into the reed, you're actually, that's the part of the sound that's the part of the motion that stops the reed from vibrating. And then coming off the reed is actually the one that releases it and gets the vibration going, and that produces the sound. So there's actually very little achieved by slamming the tongue into the reed and getting that. It's a very thuddy sound. Let me demonstrate. It's a bit of an obnoxious sound, to be honest. And it often, in terms of applying that to phrasing, like in a jazz melody or a jazz solo, articulation like that can produce accents that are really disproportionate with just the sort of the prevailing dynamic that you're playing at. And they can seem a bit exciting, but to be honest, they're more, I find them more disruptive and a little bit of a bit of a sledgehammer approach to a task that should be a little bit more finessed. So with your articulation, think about that. Make sure that you're able to play legato and get a really smooth sound. The motion that I actually think about is it's actually somewhat akin conceptually to me with like a cracking a whip. So it's sort of a motion where you're going towards the reed, but then actually coming away. So that the tongue, of course, isn't actually making this kind of flopping motion like that. But in terms of applying the force, I almost think about it like that. That there's sort of you're actually articulating as you move away from the reed, rather than articulating into the reed itself. So the legato sound being. Near the tip of the tongue, near the tip of the reed. Okay, the third area that I want to talk about today has to do with the air management on the saxophone. Now, one of the kind of key, I suppose, problems I find with some earlier developing players is that they play the sort of various registers of the saxophone with different types of air. So what I mean by that is that they're particularly giving drastically different levels of air support. So that's where we sort of coming from the abdomen, supporting the air, so that it's a sort of a consistent speed and a consistent fullness of sound, I suppose is the idea. So one of the common issues is playing with way more support, so like pushing the air a lot harder, going up into the area above the staff, so above the treble clef. So that would be on the saxophone, the area basically in the left hand above the staff, so from say around G and up. A good way just to check out what you're doing on the saxophone there is just to play some octaves and really try to focus as much as possible on just pressing the octave key and seeing what happens. So let me demonstrate. So I'm just going to stick with a G. I'll play a G again. All I'm going to do is press the octave key and take it off and repeat. Okay, so what I'm thinking about while I'm doing that is trying to make sure that my air support is consistent for both registers. The temptation is sometimes to either add extra air support and push the air out a little bit more in the upper register, or sometimes, depending on where you do most of your playing, it might even be to drop the air support in the low register, because you might think that you don't need to do it anymore because you don't have to sort of get it up the octave like that. In any case, I really recommend trying to just keep the air support consistent, so that you can play through the octaves like that without having to either adjust for intonation or a tonal change or anything like that. What's key is really in that exercise is the slurring. Any use of tongue, so articulation from the tongue on the reed, will blur the results of that sort of diagnostic test a little bit. So make sure with that particular exercise, if you're playing your octaves, make sure you are slurring them, because you should be able to make those transitions using the octave key and using consistent air. Articulation is actually something that lays on top of the other playing that you're doing, and it adds definition to what you're doing. But from my perspective, at least, I think we shouldn't be relying on articulation to actually be able to play the saxophone and play the phrases we're trying to get out. Okay, so octaves is one thing. You could develop that into a scalar idea, for example. Particularly, I would say it's most helpful to try to focus on fingerings that are reproduced at the octave. So that would be essentially from low D up to high C sharp. That's the sort of the span of those notes. So I might, for example, just play the first four notes of a G major scale in octaves. Slurring throughout, just checking out how it goes. If you find that you are unable to slur down, or if you slur up and it's out of tune, that just gives you a bit of a clue that you're actually changing changing your embouchure as you go, and is sort of alerting you to the fact that you might need to pay a little bit closer attention to having more consistency in your air and in your embouchure. Okay. Then in terms of developing that further, you can try, obviously a perfect octave is quite a large interval, but you're still only kind of dealing with the span of an octave. You could try some other large intervals and use them to just test your ability to play with consistent air through a range of different notes. So for example, I might use an open position triad. So rather than playing the first 3 notes of the triad, 1, 3, 5, inside the span of an octave, so it'll only span a perfect fifth, I could try 1, 5, 3. So it actually, this phrase, it actually sounds a little bit, well, it sounds a lot like Bach's first, the prelude to the first cello suite in C. So by playing through a slightly larger span, even though the intervals are smaller, a larger span, you're actually testing your ability to manage air over a little bit larger set of intervals. You could also try adding other notes to that. That was on the tenor saxophone, that was a G major open position triad. You could try other triad qualities or other chord types. There's lots of different ways you can test that out, but I would say that large intervals and large spans are a really important tool for testing your ability to control your air and keep it consistent. Thanks for watching the video. Let us know in the comments how you go with those exercises and if you're having any of your own technical challenges with the saxophone. And we'll see you next time.